Well, good afternoon, everyone. With the temperatures that are rapidly on the rise, with over 70% of our state in some way impacted by the heat, we wanted to come forward with you all today to give you the necessary information and explain the necessary precautions that you're going to need to be taking. While the heat advisory does not indicate that things are going to get anywhere approaching the range that we saw in the Pacific Northwest, the city will still be extremely hot, and we know that our seniors and especially our vulnerable residents and people experiencing homelessness will be disproportionately impacted. And so that's the first message. We need everybody to be looking out for their neighbor. We need everybody to be looking out for those that are most vulnerable in our city and make sure that they have the right information that we're going to be able to provide you today about the services that will be available. We have a number of different jurisdictions that are working together, including the City of Minneapolis as well as Hennepin County. We have a number of different nonprofit services as well that will be available, and we've got Steve Horsfield from Simpson Housing that is also here with us, and he'll be able to provide some information as well. And of course, when we see extreme weather conditions, those that are most impacted by the weather are people that don't have houses. And so we want to look out for those of our own in our unsheltered community first. And I'll note that we've put expansive new funding into our shelter system over this last year, and that is really critical on hot days just like this to know the following things. First, we have cooling spaces in the form of shelters that will be available 24 hours a day, 7 days per week. We've also substantially expanded the number of shelters and shelter beds that we have in place since last year. With investments of over $26.5 million that we've put into our shelter system and for outreach services, we have managed to provide more than 200 additional beds in our shelter system than we had last year. 200 additional beds. Presently, we have dozens of beds that are available in our shelter system. We have plenty of space that is available for cooling, especially as the temperatures rise. And as Mr. Steve Horsfield will tell you just shortly, we haven't needed to turn anybody away from the Connect system since April of last year. That's a really critical fact, and I want to say thanks to these investments, we are able to make some really substantial impacts for the better. And I know that our CPED team is additionally continuing to do extensive outreach, ensuring that residents who are experiencing homelessness have clean drinking water, have food, and access to services. And our director of the Community Planning and Economic Development team, and Andrea Brennan, will be speaking to that as well. So I know that there are many organizations and individuals that are really committed to helping our neighbors experiencing homelessness or those who reside in encampments. And my ask for all of us engaged in this work is to approach it with a shared conviction and a shared resolve to prioritize, above all else, public health. Keep people safe and continue working towards that overriding goal, which we all know is ultimately providing stable and permanent housing for our residents experiencing homelessness. Additionally, just about every single expert in the field has agreed and recognizes that reaching that goal of providing long-term and permanent affordable housing begins in service-rich environments like shelters. At our shelter system, we have the ability to make the proper connections. We have the ability to provide people with a broad array of services, ranging from connection to a stable home, to addiction treatment, to mental health services. And if any of you have any questions of all, if anybody has any questions about shelter access or help finding a location that is near you, please reach out to the Adult Shelter Connect at 612-248-2350. That's 612-248-2350. The last year and a half, as we've seen, has only deepened some of the inequities in our city. Many of the fault lines of disparities have been further exposed, and we know that it's incumbent on all of us to do everything that we can, not to cover up those fault lines, but ultimately bridge those gaps in services. So that will help us to reflect on the broader reality that we're experiencing, and that is most certainly our shared commitment. And with that, I will turn it over to our Director of the Community Planning and Economic Development Department, Andrea Brennan, who has been leading so much work around providing the necessary connectivity and access to our shelter system and ultimately stable housing. Director?
Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrea Brennan, Director of Community Planning and Economic Development. As the Mayor mentioned, we have 200 more shelter beds available now than we did a year ago, and those shelter beds include low barrier and culturally specific shelter. In addition, we have another 36-bed facility that is under construction. And this is due to the significant investment that the city and the county has made in the last year. Shelters are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They have COVID-19 protocols in place and have wraparound services that can help people transition out of shelter and into permanent housing. Over the last year, we have also added new city-funded outreach teams and outreach contracts. We now contract with Avivo and American Indian Community Development Corporation, 2 nonprofits, in addition to our long-standing contract relationship with St. Stephen's. We provide funding to these organizations to provide important connections to housing and services for people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. In addition to the contract providers that provide outreach services to people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, in 2021, the city has hired 3 new homeless response coordinators. These are city staff that are specifically focused on engaging with residents in encampments, engaging with residents experiencing unsheltered homelessness, and they are there to provide health supports, connecting with our contracted street outreach providers to complete housing assessments for housing placements, and working to identify safe places for people experiencing unsheltered homelessness to stay indoors. During times like this, our outreach providers also are coordinating basic needs such as water to people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. The Hennepin County has also hired a new staff person focused on unsheltered homelessness, and the county and the city staff focused on this outreach work very closely with one another, as well as our contracted street outreach providers. These new city and county staff were specifically brought on board to focus on a housing-centered approach or response to unsheltered homelessness, working with our outreach teams to engage on an individual-by-individual basis with people experiencing unsheltered homelessness to work on swift exits out of homelessness and into housing. Again, housing is the goal. In addition to the investments in new shelter space and in outreach work, the city continues to make investments in new permanent supportive housing, and that investment has increased by a factor of 6 in the last few years. An additional 284 permanent supportive housing units specifically made available to people experiencing homelessness were constructed and completed in 2020, and another 350 units are under construction right now. We are also working on new policies, including zoning changes that will allow for new low barrier housing, such as single room occupancy housing. The City Council tomorrow morning will be voting on changes to our SRO ordinance to allow for our housing continuum and range of options to expand to include this really critical housing component of our housing continuum. And with that, I think I'll hand it back to the Mayor to introduce David.
Thank you, Director Brennan. Now I'd like to bring up the Director of Housing Stability for Hennepin County, and Mr. David Hewitt, who's been doing some really incredible work, especially over this last year and a half, where so much of the focus has been directly on him and his team. And thank you so much, Mr. Hewitt, for your work.
Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, everybody. David Hewitt with Hennepin County. It was a little over a year ago that our homeless system faced a sudden and terrifying challenge. A global pandemic that was most easily transmitted in congregate settings and most dangerous to seniors and vulnerable people. Ever since that point, our local shelter providers have been working tirelessly, both to keep people safe from this new risk and to keep people safe from the ongoing acute health and safety risks posed by unsheltered homelessness. Of course, those are at the forefront of our thinking at a time like this. In order to keep people safe, transformation was required. With support, as you heard, from the city, the county, the state, philanthropy, new shelters opened that were specifically designed to meet the needs of people who had historically gone unsheltered. Existing shelters made physical changes, adding restrooms, airflow systems, outdoor space. They moved to 24/7 operating, and most critically added that case management to help people move into permanent housing. All of this was informed, working alongside people who had experienced homelessness themselves, especially the Street Voices of Change group. And the key goal is that we need to ensure that people are leaving shelter for permanent housing on a daily basis, and that's what gives us that capacity to bring new people in each day as well. Because of those changes, we stand here today having avoided an outbreak at the scale that other communities have seen, and also with a shelter system that is better equipped to meet the health and housing needs of vulnerable people throughout our community moving forwards. Our family shelter system has 70 private rooms available as of this minute. The phone number for families is 612-348-9410. I will let Steve Horsfield from Simpson Housing speak to the single adult system next, but I do want to also notify people of the website hennepin.us/call for anybody that needs to get out of this heat and finding a calling site near them. Finally, we did pass a landmark this week that I wanted to highlight. We moved folks who were senior and at highest risk from COVID into pandemic shelters at the start of the outbreak. Last November, we brought online a temporary case management team to help them move to permanent housing. This week, we passed the 300th person from that group who have moved into their own permanent home. This is the goal, this is what we work for. Earlier this summer, Hennepin County Board of Commissioners approved $14 million from American Rescue Plan funding to expand that team, to double its size over the coming years, so we can help more and more people across our shelter system, across our unsheltered settings, to get into housing every single day. With that, I can hand over to Steve Horsfield. Well, back to you.
No,
excuse me.
Yeah. Next is Steve Horsfield, the Executive Director of Simpson Housing. Thank you for all your work, Steve. Come on up.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My name is Steve Horsfield. I'm with Simpson Housing Services. One of the functions at Simpson that we operate for the nearly 4 years now, we've been operating the Adult Shelter Connect office in partnership with our peer agencies that also provide single adult shelter, and with funding from Hennepin County. This is a single front door for folks to access the single adult shelter system in Hennepin County. And I'm gratified to say that, as the mayor mentioned, since April of this year, we have not had to turn anyone away due to capacity within the single adult shelter system. So we're certainly pleased for that. I would say that we were still concerned. Our Adult Shelter Connect staff was still concerned with what things might be looking like this week with the heat wave coming on, and so some additional outreach work was done to our shelter providers, and we were able to add an additional 16 beds at Simpson to accommodate additional folks who might need space this week, as well as a couple of additional beds at First Covenant Church, a shelter that's operated by St. Stephen's Human Services. In addition to that work, the function of the Adult Shelter Connect office has really been vital over these years to be able to reduce the stress for folks who are needing to seek shelter in Hennepin County, and provide a place for us as a community to be able to make resources available. So this week, even in addition to the regular work of assigning shelter beds, as folks are calling in during the day today and just looking for a place to get cool and be safe during the heat, we're also able to make use of Hennepin County resources and other resources in the community to refer people out to cooling stations as well. And I think that is what I've got. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Horsfield. My apologies for jumping the gun on the big announcement and for all of your work regarding making sure that everybody had access over the last 12 plus months since April. With that, I'll open it up to any questions you might have.
Mr. Mayor, we're hearing a lot of open beds right now, but I've connected with people who live in encampments right now who don't want any part of these programs. What then?
Well, that's part of the information that we're trying to get out right now. We recognize that, at least historically, there have been a number of reasons why people have not wanted to use our shelter system. to name a few. Safety concerns, a second, inability to be with more than one or so family member at the same time, and the third, of course, it's addiction and different mental health reasons. Now, simultaneously, we want to make sure that people are well aware that we have shelter beds available. As Mr. Horsfield mentioned, not a single person has been turned away from our connectivity line since April of last year. Right now, there are dozens of beds available. We've added over 200 beds in this last year through a $26.5 million investment. That includes, of course, other services as well. And as we move through this heat wave right now, we want to make sure people are aware. You can go inside. You can go into a cooler climate and a cooler condition indoors in a shelter system that, by the way, also has additional services that have been provided to you. I'll add that these shelter systems, we are better able to provide wraparound services through a centrally located node that you can't necessarily get at an encampment. And so we're asking people to use these shelter systems because it works.
Speak to those outreach persons that have connected with those living in an encampment to talk about those conversations. What are they like when they essentially say, we want to be out here, we want to be at the parks, we want to be at this property, whatever it is. Can anybody address what those conversations are like?
Go for it.
Thank you for the question. So, as you heard from Director Brennan, the city has added contracts with Avivo and American Indian Community Development Corporation to the long-standing relationship with St. Stephen's Human Services, delivering outreach directly to people in encampments and other unsheltered settings. With regards to what is that conversation like, it's about building trust, building rapport, bringing services to people, helping people identify and make that step, whether that's to a shelter or indeed to some other safe indoor option that can be identified, including direct connection to permanent housing options. I would add that when we talk about shelter and the needs of people who have expressed those reservations about coming inside, that the shift of the last year hasn't just been to add beds. It has been to add very different kinds of shelters that are specifically targeted at the needs of people who have historically used encampments instead. The American Indian Community Development Corporation Homeward Bound Shelter is a first of its type, culturally specific shelter run by the Native American community for the Native American community. The Avivo Villages shelter was designed in community with people in encampments to offer the kind of individual living spaces that people said that they wanted and that would help them come inside. So that's been the effort. It's been outreach, have that conversation, build relationship, try to identify what will bring people inside, and on the back end, create a greater variety and quality of options so that people are more inclined to do so.
And I'll add, David said that far better than I could, but these shelters that we've added over this last year, they have been to accommodate some of the feedback that we've gotten from people in our encampments throughout our city. At the Avivo Center, we've made sure that people have a sense of privacy. They're able to shut the door. They're able to have their own space. It provides a sense of privacy and individualization that gives people the dignity that they deserve. We've got the culturally sensitive and specific shelter in Homeward Bound for our American Indian community, which has also proven to be really successful as well. And it's not that the services aren't provided to individuals in the encampments. They certainly are provided. In fact, there's a ton of work that is happening literally right now to make sure that people throughout our city, regardless of where you're living, have the necessary and direct service that they need. It's just easier to provide it when it's at a centralized location. Yes, please.
I've been speaking with Councilman Fletcher regarding his ward. There's a pretty big encampment in the Sheridan community right now. He says there's drug use. I have businesses that say that drug use is happening in their establishments, in the bathrooms, specifically in the bathrooms. It's a shared bathroom with other businesses. There was a pretty big fire recently. Is there anything to address that camp specifically when there is illegal activity on top of what I assume is illegally camping there?
Well, the situation that we're seeing over at the encampment by Sheridan is not unique. We've seen it at a number of encampments throughout our city. And the truth is that once encampments get to a certain size, we've seen that there are safety concerns, whether that's around human trafficking or drug trafficking, whether that's around violence or fires. These are aspects that do, in fact, cause pretty severe safety risks, in addition, and that's to the individuals living at the encampment, in addition to the safety risks caused to the people in the surrounding neighborhood. And so, of course, I'll be working directly with Councilmember Fletcher on that specific issue.
Any specific plans can you share regarding that encampment? There's been a handful of residents that have addressed it, either publicly or to Councilman Fletcher, that would like it gone. But of course, we know that's a very hard thing to do, dehumanizing it, to use a word as well.
Well,
eviction process is tough.
We've had outreach services already over there at that location to ensure that people do, in fact, have the awareness that there are beds available. We have shelter space available, especially through these difficult and hot times. And we also want to make sure that, again, people are safe. And so, yes, it is a process in order to find ultimately permanent housing, which is always the long-term goal. And there have been instances when the safety risk has made it very necessary to, in some form, disband the encampment itself. And so we're working with Councilmember Fletcher, with multiple different jurisdictions, and with our CPED team to make sure that we're making the right decisions through that process. Thank you.
For informing them of where these locations are, where they can go, and are there any like rules of thumb that you would recommend for people to, like, I don't know, go to a library or go to these specific buildings that are like high capacity that people could remember instead of having to look at a map?
That's a great question. So we've got a number of different facets that are available, including outreach workers that can go directly to some of these encampments to let people know where resources can be made available to them. Of course, we have are providing information about these resources available on our social media and page, internet, as well as the news, which we're doing right now, but sometimes that doesn't get to all of the individuals that need the help in a timely basis. So if I could direct this question either over to Andrea, our Director of CPED, to provide a little more information.
Sure. Thank you for the question. One of the things that we have invested very significantly in with our additional investment in outreach teams is that we have much better sort of tracking and data systems, so we know where people are being unsheltered, where folks are in encampments and outside of encampments in unsheltered situations. And we have so much more capacity in our outreach system that during times like this, just as there have been other times during civil unrest, for example, where we've just made that extra effort to make sure that we are getting outreach teams to people where they are, so that they have information, so that they're not relying on digital means of communication, but they're actually having an individual sort of approaching them and providing this information.
Andrea, I've been in multiple camps with your involved. It just seems to me, how do you pass the obstacle of, okay, I know there's a place I can go to be cool, but if I walk away from my stuff, it's gone. It's just gone.
Is there storage? I don't know if any of my colleagues can respond to that, but that is a concern that I think folks have. When we have been out asking folks to leave encampments, when we've closed encampments, we've certainly provided storage options for people who are not able to take their belongings with them. So that's something that we are doing in any time when we're asking people to leave encampments through a closure. I don't know if there's any other storage solutions that we've.
It's just not an answer. That's possible. The answer is could be, don't know. I don't know.
No, the answer. Go ahead.
One thing that I would just add is that, again, looking at the transformation in shelters, the new shelters and indeed existing shelters have added storage space, because this was one of the concerns and one of the reasons that we had heard possessions being a barrier for potentially coming inside if there was nowhere to safely store belongings. So the new shelters, and again, Avivo Villages, Homewood Bound being examples of this, very specifically have storage set up for everybody coming in. And then even the existing shelters that historically did not have added storage capacity where possible and to some extent so that people are able to store belongings when they come in. And that was actually one of the Street Voices of Change, which is an advocacy group of people who are experiencing or have experienced homelessness, developed a shelter bill of rights with a number of items in it, which at Hennepin County we've been using as the framework for our shelter contracts moving forward. And one of the items there is storage. So that's been a priority for us, working with our partners to meet their needs around safety for their belongings.
We've got time for about one more.
Just to loop it back to one of the first questions that we had, we got feedback directly from people who were experiencing homelessness. We got feedback from Street Voices for Change, and perhaps the number one thing that they told us consistently, one of the top things they told us consistently, was that they needed additional storage space. And so about 2 years ago, we were over at the convention center talking about the additional storage space that we were able to provide. This last year, through 2 new additional shelters, we've been able to provide additional storage space so that people could have their most valuables and belongings with them. And I think that is a really critical component as to how we do ultimately transform how our shelter system functions to help people. Another question?
Last one? Sounds like we're good.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you.